Hi, I'm Ammon. This is Being in Time, video number 25. In this video, we're going to discuss our fear of time and ask whether or not it's reducible to a fear of death. Spoiler, it won't be. I know that it would be much more metal if I said that it was. And it's also certainly going to be true, I should admit, that for Heidegger, there's going to be strong connections between the fear of time and fear of death. Now, remember, we're discussing this in section 5. This is the opening to the second introduction, the methodological introduction. We've already spent 2 videos on this. In the first of them, we saw Heidegger again reintroducing what's going to be our main character, Dasein. And in Division 1, Der Dasein. Dasein in its average everydayness, the way that we are most of the time. Because the methodology we're going to develop in the rest of this introduction is going to have to be appropriate to investigating that being, and investigating that being in its concern for the world, in its care for what he's calling here the question of the meaning of being. So remember, in our average everydayness, that is to say the way that we live our lives most of the time, Heidegger does think that we're actually constantly raising the question of the meaning of being. What does it mean for things to be? The way that we interact with the world is constantly posing this question, and it's doing so in a way that we're going to call ontic. So ontically, remember, we saw that this question of the meaning of being, and ontically, we ourselves are closest to ourselves. We're the most proximal, we're the most familiar thing to us. Ontologically, though, in terms of how, in terms of the structures and in terms of our elucidation of the structures that make that possible, that's usually quite distant from us. We're not, most of the time, we're not theorizing our own lives. We're just going about living them. Now, that said, though, there's this third category, and this is going to be the crucial one, this pre-ontological category. This is back in the first introduction, we talked about this in terms of the ontico-ontological distinction. And pre-ontologically, Heidegger says, this is this weird puzzle that we've sort of gotten hung up on in the last few videos, that we are not a stranger to ourselves, but perhaps also not familiar. This is an idea that as Heidegger's philosophy goes on, he's going to develop a lot. It's going to connect to his discussion of what will be called uncanniness. The German, just as an aside, the German word there is unheimlich, which means something like not at home. And it itself is a translation of the Greek word deinon, which you might know if you know anything about dinosaurs, the terrible lizards. It's the same word, terrible. How do we get unhomeliness, terribleness, and a weird, strange, uncanny familiarity? We're not going to worry about that for now. But it's that kind of eerie vibe that we're going for. And that's why, even though we're talking about Der Dasein, we're filming this particular video here at night. In our second video on section 5, we'd read a poem by John Donne called Forbidden Mourning. And I had asked whether or not this relates to this notion in Nietzsche and Marx that we're going to pick up on here of hatred of the body. And the word body here, I think, is worth dwelling on some. I think it's far too easy, especially for philosophers, to understand bodies as, let's say, something like materialism in the sense of, so let's say, materialism versus idealism, dualism. I have a complaint about a lot of philosophers. I think a lot of philosophers just suppose that the categories of early modern philosophy, even if you're not sort of super into philosophy, mind matter stuff, a certain way of understanding the free will, questions about epistemology, reason versus emotions, etc. I would argue that these are really rooted in a way of looking at the world that might have made some sense in the 1600s and 1700s, but hasn't made a lot of sense in the last 200 years. And that doesn't make a lot of sense of philosophy before that. That might seem like an odd aside. We're actually going to come back to it in the next section of Heidegger. But the reason why I'm emphasizing it now is that when I talk about the hatred of the body, it's easy to think about this as something like hatred of matter. And that's not exactly, or the hatred of the body as opposed to, let's say, the mind or the soul. But the more relevant feature of something like the body here is, let's say, the hatred of changeability. And so we talked about this in the context of Aristotle. This is why we read Donne. Donne makes this distinction between bodies which are unchangeable and bodies which are changeable, those which inhabit the spheres beyond the moon and those which are beneath the moon. As I mentioned, this is a distinction you already see in Aristotle. Here's why I'm mentioning this in the context of Heidegger. Heidegger is going to say the following thing in section 5 about this uncanniness of the pre-ontological. Remember, he's going to say that the whole thesis of the whole book is that any understanding of being involves some reference to time. He'll almost immediately then pivot and notice that philosophers, so we're going to think here on this ontological register, this more distant register, philosophers spend a lot of time trying to talk about or trying to distinguish beings with respect to time, but distinguish between, let's say, temporal and atemporal beings, between eternal and non-eternal beings. And Heidegger right off the bat is going to say all of these, right? Even when we're trying to say that there are some beings that exist outside of time, that are eternal, that are omnipresent, we could use different words here, that really in some way, shape, or form, these actually are always in some way indexed to time. Now, this is going to be a very important idea. It's going to be an idea that we're going to come back to over and over again, including already in the next section. But for here, what I want to notice, right, is that that idea is going to be rooted in, even though this is a thing that he thinks is a prejudice, to use a word that Nietzsche will use here, this is a prejudice of philosophers. It's a prejudice of philosophers that philosophers inherit from a very ordinary, everyday phenomenon in the world, from the way that we are most of the time. So that is to say, when we start to develop our ontologies, so when we start to do formal philosophy, we're already inclined to want to cover over, the phenomenon of time. Be prejudiced towards, let's say, something like presentism. We're going to tend to think that things are only real insofar as they are not, I'm going to use this word again, indexed to time, insofar as they, let's say, last. And lasting here in its most ideal state is going to try to sort of completely remove any reference to time at all. That's a lot to shove into a small section here, and it's going to take a lot of the book to try to sort of uncover why you would think this is the case. But we're going to see over and over again ways in which Heidegger is going to try to show that we develop ruses to hide from ourselves the passage of time. That does include the fear of death as the most distant figure, right? Or let's say the final figure. It also includes all sorts of losses, and I talked about in a few videos, self-deception, etc. It might even include, as in the John Donne poem, ways to try to mollify one's spouse before one goes on a journey, or perhaps ways to mollify oneself before one goes on a journey. So, very ordinary strategies, they're going to tend to move us in a certain ontological direction. And our task, Heidegger is going to say, is going to be to stick with the passage of time. To notice that even when we're trying to remove time from the story, that we never truly do so successfully. Now, again, right now, we're just sort of introducing this idea. We're introducing it here in the methodological section because both of the two methodologies that we're going to mention from here on out, the destruction or deconstruction of the history of philosophy and the phenomenological method, are for Heidegger going to be ways of doing two things. One, drawing attention to the fully temporal character of all of our ways of making meaning. And two, also drawing attention to the way that we try to hide that temporal character from ourselves, whether it's ontically in our everyday lives, or when we start to do formal ontology, when we develop categories of thinking that tend to obscure or minimize those elements of time.